Welcome to the general integration demo for ServiceNow. Within this demo, we are going to cover the various interfaces supported with ServiceNow for getting data into the ServiceNow ecosystem, as well as getting it out to third-party systems from ServiceNow. Before we get too much into the interfaces themselves, let's talk a little bit about the structure of data within ServiceNow. ServiceNow is a database-driven application. Every piece of data or configuration setting within the application resides within the database. This data is often displayed via applications, modules, or forms within the web-based user interface. Every form in the system is essentially a database table. For example, if we were to look at the incident form, we'd be looking at a database table with these specific fields. While forms can have certain fields hidden from a user's view, they still reside against the database table itself. In ServiceNow, you can actually reference any table or form in the system by using the standard URL format that is common across all database tables in the system. To directly access a table or form within the ServiceNow system, simply type the database table name in the URL and add a .do extension to that table name. These URLs are key to components to auto-generated interfaces in the system, which we will cover in a few minutes. Every table in ServiceNow has a number of built-in interfaces that allow third-party systems to access the data within those tables. These interfaces are auto-generated, so even if you were to create a custom table or alter the field structure on an existing table within ServiceNow, you will automatically have access to those resources through the regular interfaces. Each table within the product has a web service API set that provides you full CRUD access to the data that provides functions to create, read, update, and delete the data within the system. All of the interfaces are protected with basic authentication by default. You have the powerful ability to create access control roles and custom roles in the system that allow you to protect your data and dictate exactly what your web service user has access to do within the system. Web service endpoints for each table can be generated by adding a special URL parameter to the URL of the database table. For example, if we wanted to see the web service functions available to us via the SOAP web service interface, we would simply set up a SOAP client such as SOAP UI, to consume a WSDL in the following URL format. We enter in the base URL for the instance, then we do a / and the table name. We end the table name with a .do, and then add a URL parameter of WSDL in this case. The web service client would then be able to read the WSDL document and generate the functions that are available through the web service API on your database table inside of ServiceNow. In addition to web service interfaces, ServiceNow also boasts the ability to consume email notifications in order to push data into the instance. If your third-party tool needs to get data into ServiceNow but it does not have capabilities to speak via web services, it can be configured to send that data via email. The instance can intercept the emails and handle the data within the emails to perform operations within the instance. Table-based interfaces are powerful, but they also come with some inherent challenges. First of all, if you are a third-party client and you want to access the database table APIs, you need to understand the ServiceNow database schema. Otherwise, you may push data that's not compatible with the schema for a given table within the system. For example, let's say you have a third-party tool that is going to post to the incident table within ServiceNow. Let's assume that that third-party product has a severity field that needs to map to the incident's impact field within ServiceNow. That application would have to know that it needs to send the value to the impact field rather than to a non-existing severity field. Let's also say that the third-party tool has a value of 5 for one of its severity settings. However, your impact field within ServiceNow only goes from 1 to 3. Your third-party client has to understand and keep track of the fact that only values 1 through 3 are valid. In order to handle these types of situations, we offer a staging level web service interface that exists between your third-party system and the actual database table within ServiceNow. These intermediary interfaces are called web service import sets. When you leverage the staging system, the third-party client can post data according to its own schema with its own values, without any regard to the schema within ServiceNow. ServiceNow can easily be configured to map, transform, and qualify the data that's coming into the ServiceNow table. Because these web service import sets are just regular tables within the system, you have the same APIs and interfaces associated with those tables that you have with the direct table interfaces within the product. A typical best practice around when to use direct table web services versus import set web services specify that if you're going to write or update data within ServiceNow, you should go through the web service import set interfaces rather than going directly to the table. For data queries, then you would just go against the direct web service interface for the tables. Let's go through an example of creating and configuring one of these staging services. To create a web service import set, you simply search for web service in the navigation pane. Click the Create New link found under the Inbound Web Service area. ServiceNow provides a handful of example web service import sets for your reference. To visualize such a configuration, we're just going to click into the Notification web service that has been provided out of the box as an example monitoring interface. This service was set up to mimic how you might set up a service geared to event management or monitoring data feeds. This web service has fields that may be typical with a monitoring system. Associated with this web service is a list of transform maps. These maps let you select the temporary table or staging table where the data is coming in. In this case, it's the Notification web service import set. The target table is the destination table where, once everything has been mapped and transformed, the data will actually reside. The transform map can be quickly configured by using the Mapping Assist tool, where you can drag and drop fields from the third-party schema and match them up to the target table fields within ServiceNow. ServiceNow also lets you set up logic to determine whether or not the incoming data should result in a new record in the table, or whether it should update an existing record within ServiceNow. With web service import sets, your client only needs to post an insert call to the web service. Depending on your criteria, the system will determine whether the record should be created or updated. To do this, you identify one or more coalesce fields. As data comes into the system, it will first check those fields to see if duplicate data exists in the target table for those fields. If the coalesce data matches what already exists in your table, that record will be updated rather than generate a new record in that table. Another way to get data into ServiceNow is by using a pulling mechanism within the product. Within ServiceNow, you can create records of connectivity called data sources. These data sources can be configured to consume files, Ldap sources, or even database tables. Simply navigate to the Data Sources module inside of the ServiceNow instance. To create a new record, you can click on the New button within the list. If we were going to consume data through a file, we could choose what format the system should expect that data to be in. For example, it may be in CSV or XML format. Notice also that we can pull these files from any web service or FTP type of location. When pulling data using the JDBC protocol to get data from a database, you have the option of choosing from a number of the most popular database formats. If your database system is not listed as a format option, but your database does support the JDBC protocol, a JDBC driver for that database can be uploaded into the ServiceNow instance, and you can configure the instance to read from that database server. With database pulls, you have the option of either querying an entire table or selecting your own specific SQL statement. Creating your own SQL statement is helpful if you need to do some joining of tables, or if you only want to select a handful of fields from the given table. Another powerful option is the ability to handle delta queries when querying your database. By clicking on the Use Last Run Date Time checkbox, you can specify the field within your database table that stores the last modified timestamp on a record. When ServiceNow queries the database, it's going to keep track of those, and it's going to record the last modified timestamp that it found and save it for future queries. On a subsequent query, the data source will automatically include a filter that only reads records that have been modified since the last database pull. As mentioned earlier, we can also query Ldap sources. You typically use this type of data source connection to gather user and group information from an Ldap source such as Active Directory or Novell eDirectory. Up to this point, we have talked about how to get data into your ServiceNow instance through integrations. Now let's change that discussion around and explore the methods that can be used to get data from ServiceNow so that it can be consumed by third-party systems. Just like with getting data into the instance, ServiceNow supports methods of either pushing data or allowing third parties to pull the data from ServiceNow. First, let's cover the option of a third-party service pulling data out of ServiceNow. Now, because ServiceNow exists in the cloud, it has a rigorous mechanism used to protect the customer data. Therefore, third-party systems are not allowed access to connect directly to a ServiceNow database. However, there are a number of ways that you can still utilize to get data from your ServiceNow instance. The first option that you have is to leverage a solution offered by ServiceNow called the Odbc Driver. This driver allows an application that supports the Odbc protocol to query data from ServiceNow as if it had a native database connection. Behind the scenes, the SQL communication is translated into web service calls that have been tailored for bulk communication with the instance. This allows applications such as Crystal reports or data warehousing applications or spreadsheets even to have the ability to make database queries against ServiceNow. ServiceNow also allows you to pull information out using SOAP or REST-based web services. With SOAP, you can pull data out in the XML format. With the RESTful interfaces, you can export data in XML, JSON, CSV, and other popular formats. To demonstrate this, you can quickly export data from a ServiceNow table by entering the URL for the table itself, and then adding a URL parameter defined by ServiceNow for exporting the data in a specific format. For example, if you wanted to export the data in XML format, simply use the XML URL parameter. If you want to export the data in JSON format, use the JSON v2 URL parameter. Using these parameters, data can be paged, filtered, and sorted before it's exported to the browser or to a file. We also have an active community that's busy writing language-based libraries that allow access into ServiceNow to perform functions such as pulling data out of ServiceNow for third-party consumption. These libraries leverage the web service interface provided by ServiceNow. We've seen libraries developed by the community using Python, PHP, Perl, and even Java. Now, before we go into the methods of pushing data from ServiceNow to a third party, let's introduce the concept of the mid-server. Obviously, since ServiceNow exists in the cloud, integrations will often need to access third-party services that reside behind your firewall. Rather than requiring customers to poke holes in their firewalls or establish VPN tunnels between them and ServiceNow, ServiceNow has created a small Java agent that can run on a computer within your network. This small agent runs as a service that simply just sleeps and wakes up every few seconds to make an outbound web service call to the ServiceNow instance to a specific job queue. If it finds job for it to do, it'll execute that job locally inside your network, and then it's going to post the response for that job back to the job queue in the instance so that ServiceNow can react on the information that was gathered. With this solution, there is no need to adjust your corporate firewall in order for ServiceNow to communicate with your third-party endpoints. With that quick introduction to the mid-server, let's discuss how ServiceNow can be configured to push data out to a third-party system. Before we talk about the endpoints that are supported, let's quickly discuss the triggers that can be leveraged within the instance to kick off communication between ServiceNow and a third-party system. Within ServiceNow, you have the ability to set up an event schedule to kick off specific jobs or activities within the system. Some of those activities could be to communicate with a third-party system. These jobs can be executed based on a time or date, based on relative periods, can be set for on-demand interaction, or they can be set to execute in relation to another job finishing its execution in the system. ServiceNow's graphical workflow tool can also be configured to communicate with third-party systems. These workflows offer activities that can be dragged and dropped onto a workflow so that given a certain stage inside the workflow, communication can be triggered to the third party. You'll typically leverage this type of trigger when building out orchestration activities within ServiceNow. Probably the most common method of triggering integrations inside of ServiceNow to third parties is what we call a business rule. With business rules, you have the capability to monitor database tables. For example, if we were to go to our incident form, we could create a new business rule for that table. Business rules watch a table for specific conditional events to occur. For example, you could look for new record creations or updates to existing records, deletion of a record, or even records being queried by the system. More extensive conditions can also be built into this condition field. For example, if you wanted to trigger an action to take place when the due date of an incident ticket changes, you could type that into the condition rule field for this to take place. These business rules are very flexible and offer a powerful mechanism to allow you to specify triggers into a third-party system. Another trigger point could be built around the event management system inside of ServiceNow. As certain events take place within the system, they are recorded in the internal event manager. You can set up your integrations to watch those events and trigger off of one of those events firing within the system. Finally, you have the ability to add buttons and links and other UI components to your forms. When these are pressed, you can configure them to trigger communications to a third party. For example, I could set up an integration between ServiceNow and Dell Computer's warranty web service. That way, if I had a workstation in my CMDB that was a Dell computer with a serial number recorded, I could manually click on the button requesting information from Dell. The button would trigger a web service request to the Dell Warranty Information web service, and once the information was returned from that web service, we could display that information on the form to the user. These integrations can be triggered by buttons, links, and other UI components in the system. Now that we have explained the triggers, let's talk about the endpoints that we can communicate with. Just as we can receive email messages and handle them for integrations, we can similarly send out email notifications based on the events that are triggered within the ServiceNow system. Those email notifications can be configured to send out any data that you need to include for an integration. Probably the most popular way to send data out to a third party is via SOAP or REST-based web services. ServiceNow tries to make the setup of these connections as easy as possible for the user. Let's take an example of consuming a SOAP-based web service. For this example, we can use the stock quote web service that is a publicly available web service on the internet. Once you have the record open, you can either download the WSDL using a URL, or you can paste the contents of an actual WSDL into the record itself. Once you have done this, click on the link called Generate Sample SOAP Messages, and ServiceNow will reach out, grab the WSDL, read the document, parse it, and generate a catalog of services that are supported by that web service. Once you have these functions, you can open up one of the functions and view the template that was auto-generated by ServiceNow. This template will auto-detect the places where data might need to be inserted. In those places, it will add a special variable into the template so that you can test the web service with your own data. For example, we can set the symbol variable to a stock symbol that we're interested in, and then submit it to the web service. We'll do so by clicking the test link. The actual request that was sent out, as well as the response that was returned, will be displayed back to you when you test the web service. You can easily generate the required script that kicks off this web service call in case you need to do this in a scripted area of the product. To do this, simply click the Preview Script Usage link to generate the code that was used to make the web service call. You can copy that code and place it in a business rule or some other scripted area within ServiceNow to be part of your integrated scripting library. The ServiceNow REST-based consumer acts as in a very similar fashion as the SOAP message library. As mentioned before, we can also make database calls through the JDBC protocol to third-party databases using a mid-server to broker that communication. ServiceNow can also execute PowerShell scripts, Bash scripts, or even any other command line utilities to interact with a third-party service. Of course, this will need to go through a mid server that has access to the command line or PowerShell interface. Finally, the mid server can be set up to consume Java jar files, which make the libraries contained in those files accessible to ServiceNow through JavaScript. This allows ServiceNow the ability to communicate in a native fashion to Java programs that don't have a web service API. This has been a quick demo covering the out-of-box integration interfaces within the ServiceNow platform. For more in-depth information on any of these interfaces, please check out the ServiceNow wiki for documentation and examples. Thank you for watching this video.